Just to say a few words about my encounter with Ralph. We met a couple of years ago at the Albright Institute in Jerusalem. And I have to tell you that I met yet another person who fell in love with Adam Zertal, and someone that this special soul of Adam Zertal changed him, put him on a course in life where he decided to go into archaeology and to researching certain times in history. And so I'm really happy and honored to have met Dr. Ralph Hawkins. And Ralph also did something amazing, and he gave me two of his books, which I'm going to talk about again also at the end after the lecture. The first book is How Israel Became a People, and the second book is The Iron Age I Structure on Mount Ebal, which talks solely about the altar on Mount Ebal. And I highly, highly recommend these books. I'm not an archaeologist, and I was able to read them and understand everything. So I really highly recommend purchasing those books. Dr. Ralph Hawkins is a professor of religion and the director of the program in religion at Everett University in Danville, Virginia. He holds a Doctor of Ministry degree from the School of Theology at the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee, and a PhD in Biblical and Ancient Near Eastern Archaeology from Andrews University. He has been involved in the archaeological fieldwork since 1995 and has been on staff at Tel Jalul and Khirbet Ataruz, both in Jordan. In 2015, he co-founded with Dr. David Ben Shlomo the Jordan Valley Excavation Project, which is conducting ongoing excavations in the region. In addition to numerous articles and reviews in Hebrew Bible and Near Eastern archaeology, he has published Joshua, How Israel Became a People, The Iron Age Structure on Mount Ebal, Excavations and Interpretation, and an ordained minister. Hawkins has also written pastoral books, including While I Was Praying, Finding Insights About God in Old Testament Prayers, and Leadership Lessons, Avoiding the Pitfalls of King Saul. He and his wife, Kathy, have three daughters, Hannah, Sarah, and Mary, and a son, Adam. By the way, did you call him Adam because of Adam Zertal?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, okay. Just before you start, I just want to mention something that you might say a bit more during your lecture. But, when we're talking about Joshua's altar and archaeology and biblical archaeology, we're talking inside the maximalist camp. In other words, archaeologists that believe that the Bible is describing real historical events. We're talking about two schools of thought that claim that the Exodus that is mentioned in the Bible happened in different time periods in history. And so Dr. Ralph Hawkins, along with Professor Adam Zertal and Shai Bar, and correct me if I'm wrong later on, see the Exodus as happening around the reign of Ramses II or his father, around the year 1300, 1250. Whereas the other school of archaeology, biblical archaeology, and we're going to hear Dr. Scott Stripling next week, believes in a more earlier date, around the year 1350 or 1400. So this is just to put us in the right scale of things. And without further ado, Dr. Ralph Hawkins, lead on.
Okay, terrific. I closed my PowerPoint a few minutes ago because for some reason it was scrolling through uncontrollably. So I'm going to try to share my screen again here. There we go. Okay. All right. Yeah, strange. I don't know why it's doing that. Okay, should be all set. Great to be with you all. And I just want to begin by expressing my thanks to Aaron for coordinating this class. This is so great. As Aaron said, yeah, really my whole academic life has been shaped by Zertal's influence. I worked for him as a volunteer in the Highlands on a site called El Akhawat for 4 seasons back in the 90s, and just fell under Adam's spell. And but I need to refrain from going into that story because that'll eat up my time. But it was because of his influence that I chose to go back to graduate school and major in Near Eastern archaeology, and wrote my dissertation on Mount Ebal, and named my first son after Adam. So yeah, he certainly had a big influence on my life. And the Ebal site, as Aaron has said to you a number of times, has been neglected by the scholarly community. It's been neglected in 2 fields, the fields of archaeology and also the field of biblical studies. And I'm going to refrain from going into that because of the time. So, but I'm delighted that he's putting on this class because we together, he and I and the other presenters, we all share the desire to spread the word about the Ebal site, and to encourage academics both in biblical studies and in the world of archaeology to look at this site, to consider the data, and to study it. And so this is a worthwhile endeavor, and I'm very glad that you're all here to be a part of it and to share in this study. So I'm going to push right in and start sharing with you a few quick words of introduction. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I don't know. I'm screen sharing, Aaron, but for some reason my goodness. I'm going to stop and try again. Share screen. All right, let's try that again. All right. Okay, yeah, okay. All right, hopefully this will work. I don't know, for some reason I'm having a little trouble there. All right, let's jump in. Yeah, first of all, the description in the book of Joshua, Joshua chapter 8, verses 30 through 35, contain a description about the construction of the altar. That Shai set the stage a little bit last time, and hopefully you've read these verses, Joshua 8, 30 through 35. The description of the construction of the altar there is a fulfillment of Deuteronomy 27, 4 through 8, where we find God conveying the instructions that he gave, which was, when you go into the land of Canaan for the conquest, one of the first things God wanted them to do was go up to Mount Ebal and build an altar there and renew the covenant. So in Joshua 8, here we have the fulfillment of God's command to Moses. And we're told in Joshua 8 that he built an altar of uncut stones there on Mount Ebal, and he made 2 types of offerings there. We'll come back to these later, burnt, and another type of offering called the shlemim in Hebrew, the fellowship offerings or the peace offerings. And again, we'll come back to that. And in addition, we're told that Joshua copied onto stones the law of Moses. So here is the background. And then again, Shai showed you this picture early in Adam's archaeological career. In the process of surveying the Manasseh territory, he and his team were crossing over Mount Ebal, and they discovered this large mound of stones on the second slope of the northern side of the summit, and decided it was clear from the pottery found on the surface of the pile of stones that it dated to the early Iron Age. And I'll refer throughout my talk to the late Bronze Age, which is 1550 to 1200, and the early Iron Age, also known as Iron Age 1, is 1200 to 1000 BCE, and then Iron Age 2 is 1586. So those are the three periods we'll be talking about: Late Bronze, Iron Age 1, and Iron Age 2. So he set about excavating this huge mound of stones, and over the course of several seasons, they unearthed a structure that looked like this. And I believe Shai also shared this image with you. So after several seasons of excavation, this is what the structure on Mount Ebal looked like. Here's a rendition. Shai showed you a similar one. I'm in the process of finishing up a commentary on the book of Joshua, and I hired Lean Rittmeyer to make a reconstruction of the Ebal altar for me, and this is his rendition. It's, again, very similar to the one that Shai already showed you, but so there's the structure in the dirt, the stone structure, and here's Lean's drawing of it, and we'll come back and look at this picture in a little more detail later. So let's talk about it. My task today is Shai introduced you to the physical data about the site, showed you the site and its features, the features of the main structure, and some of the archaeological material found in association with it. What we're going to do today is talk about how the academic community responded to the Zertal's discovery. We'll look at those interpretations that the academic community suggested, and then we'll respond to those by looking at the possibility that the structure may be an altar, and we'll talk about what data suggests that, and then we'll look in detail at the instructions we have in the Torah about altar design, and then we'll draw some conclusions at the end. So that's the plan. Shai had mentioned at the end of his talk last time, or during the course of his talk, that over the course of his excavation, that Zertal had that he had been raised as an atheist on an atheistic kibbutz, that he did not go into this project with a view towards proving the Bible. And I'm sure Adam said it in print somewhere, but he told me several times, and I'm sure he said it in public settings and to other friends and colleagues, that his initial interpretation of the Ebal site, but before they had finished excavating it, as the structure began to be uncovered from the stones, he initially surmised that they may have been excavating a farmstead, and that the structure may have been domestic in nature. But over time, as the structure began to be uncovered and they began to look at and consider all the different parallels, he eventually concluded that it was an altar. But he didn't set out with that. That was not a foregone conclusion for him. Again, he did not have preconceived notions about it. He wasn't trying to prove the Bible. He had not been raised believing the Bible. But in any case, in 1985, he published an article in the Biblical Archaeology Review in which he proposed that this site may have been the altar of Joshua 8:30 through 35. Okay. Now, the scholarly reaction to that was immediate, and not sure how to say it. To say the least, it was vehement. The scholarly reaction was immediate and vehemently opposed to the idea that this was an altar and that it had any connection to Joshua 8:30 through 35. One of the most outspoken critics, I'll show you his picture in a little bit, was a guy named Aharon Kempinski. And he argued that the site was that the site as a whole was a village, and that the main structure at the site, what we're calling the altar, he argued that the main structure should be interpreted as a house that over time was remodeled into a watchtower. So the structure was either a house or a watchtower, or some kind of an evolutionary design where it began as a house and was remodeled as a watchtower. Another immediate and sort of mocking reaction was by one of the giants of American biblical archaeology, William G. Deaver. And I heard him, I didn't hear it in person, but I heard a tape recording of this lecture in 1992. He gave a lecture at the Smithsonian Institute. And when he got to this point in his lecture where he reached the early Israelite settlement in Canaan, and he mentioned Zertal's structure, and he actually burst out laughing and jokingly dismissed the site as a barbecue site. He said this was nothing more than a site where families came on the afternoon and had family picnics and barbecues and so on. And so Aharon Kempinski and Bill Deaver and others accused Adam Zertal of being biased, and they argued that his conclusion that the site was an altar was a result of his bias. So again, that's what we'll do today, is we'll look at each of these arguments and talk about them. So let's jump right in. Let's look at Aharon Kempinski's argument that the Ebal site may have been a village. Kempinski lived from 1939 to 1944, and a very important archaeologist, wrote a number of really important studies, so I don't mean to demean him or ridicule his scholarship in any way, but he was definitely opposed to Zertal's interpretation of the site. And in an article that he wrote in direct response to Zertal's 1985 article, Kempinski said that when he visited the site, it seemed to him to be the remains of a small settlement enclosed by a wall. Okay, a small settlement enclosed by a wall. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to shift a little bit here. I'm in the direct sun. There we go. That's a little better. The light was coming in my office there, shining on my face. So he thought that the site was domestic in nature. There at the Ebal site, we've got the remains of a small settlement enclosed by a wall. Now let's look at village settlements and see what they look like. Here is a very famous site plan you may possibly recognize. This is a plan of the early Iron Age settlement at a site called Isbet Sarta. And this is well known as an early Israelite settlement site. If you get my book, How Israel Became a People, I have a whole chapter on this site in the book, explaining why this ought to be viewed as an early Israelite settlement site, and and what the data are associated with the site and how it should be interpreted and all. But in any case, this is a type of a settlement known in Hebrew as a chatzer style settlement. Chatzer refers to the oval shape of the site, and you can see the ring here. So it's an oval shape, and what they would do in the early Iron Age 1200 to 1000 BC. So this is the earliest stage of the Israelite settlement. they would build houses in a circle. And so you see here, the backs of the houses are facing to the outside of the site, okay? So the front door would be like here, facing to the interior of the site. So the oval shape makes an enclosure, a big open space, and all the doors of the houses face toward the interior of the enclosure, and the backs of the houses form the exterior of the site, okay? So a key idea here is in the earliest phase of Israelite settlement, the settlers were not building fortified defensive sites, okay? There's no wall here. You see that this is an enclosure made by the houses themselves, where the backs of the houses face the outside. So there's literally no wall around the site. Does that make sense? The houses themselves create the enclosure. And these are very simple villages. They're comprised of this belt of houses. And what they would do is they would use the interior of the enclosure to corral their animals. All right, so they'd live in the houses, and at night they'd corral their animals in the interior of the enclosure. Okay, over time, beyond the Iron Age 1. So again, this is the village design in Iron Age 1, 1200 to 1000 BCE. When we get beyond the Iron Age 1 into the Iron Age 2, 1586, what happened is they would begin to build into the enclosure, so that over time you'd get a whole mess of structures inside the enclosure. And this type of village has been referred to as an agglomerated village. It's an agglomeration of houses built into the midst of the enclosure. So in the Iron Age 2, you get built up cities where the interior is filled up, and so on. Okay, look at the Ebal site. Shai showed you a similar photo last time. So here's the central structure, and you've just got this ring of stones creating an enclosure around it. Okay, just to make it a little more clear, here's Judith Deckel's drawing of the site. You see that the plan we have here of the Ebal site is inconsistent with a village layout. Does that make sense? What we have here is a low wall. It's not very large at all. It's just, it's just a few courses of stones high. A low wall surrounding an isolated building in the center. Okay, that's not a village plan. It's not the Chatzer model of a village, and it's not the agglomerated design of a village. Does that make sense? Okay. What about the idea that the main structure, so here we have the structure at the heart of the site. What about the idea that this may have been a house in the beginning? All right, well, house design in ancient Israelite society was pretty standardized. It followed what has come to be known in archaeology as the four-room house design. This is known as a distinctive style of Israelite house that began to be developed really at the end of the late Bronze Age, and it became the standard type of Israelite design all the way through the Iron Age 2, up until the Babylonians invaded and destroyed, until the nation was destroyed. This was the diagnostic type of Israelite house for more than 600 years. Okay, so the four-room house. What was involved in the four-room house? Well, this is you see here the outer walls. So the four-room house typically had an entrance. So you see the entrance right there. All right, so an entrance or doorway built into the plan of the house. Then it would have four rooms. Now, this is the type of house has come to be known as a four-room house, although technically they don't really have four rooms. But you see the basic design. It has one room here, two rooms here, and then the third room here. But as you can see from this plan, these three rooms are really subdivided into multiple spaces, but It's just come to be the term four-room house. So don't argue with it, just accept it. Okay. And then, so you have these three rooms kind of going, let's just call them vertical. They're going straight to the back. And in the back, you typically will have a fourth horizontal room. In a typical sort of four-room house, the back room, like at Tel El Meiri over in Jordan, that back room was used for storing storage jars, large collared rim jars. Then you'd have a main, not really a room, more of a hallway, a central room going down the middle. And that room would often be a dirt floor, and it would have, like hearths or fireplaces built into the floor. The two side rooms, 1, 2, would often be paved with cobblestones. And then in the middle, they would have columns. See these dots, these represent columns. Those columns would go all the way down. And between the columns, there would be hearths, or troughs for putting foodstuffs to feed animals. And then animals would be kept in these outer side rooms. They'd be paved, and then the central room there would be dirt. Okay, so you have an entryway, the 4 rooms, columns, and then typically with the 4-room houses, most scholars think that they would have a stairway to access a second floor where the living quarters would be. In the case of the 4-room house at Tel El Meiri, the stairway is found right behind the back wall. It's on the outside and it goes up to the second floor. So that's just an example. Okay. So again, this type of house design became standard. Here are some samples of other 4-room houses found at other Israelite sites. That goes all the way down to the 6th century when Judah was destroyed. Okay, look, so look here, look at the 4-room house plan, and then look at the Ebal structure. And, at the Ebal structure down here, there are no columns, there's no doorway, there's no stairway. All right, there is a paved platform at the top. Zertal at least surmised that the top was a paved platform in its final stages. It has a ramp that goes down. Now, Kempinski supposed that ramp was a fallen wall. Okay, he said that was just a collapsed wall. But if you go visit the site, and I'll show you some close-up pictures in a little bit, that ramp is actually 22 feet long, and it has a consistent 5-degree slope with no variation down the entire 22-foot length. It's not a collapsed wall. Okay, it was designed this way, of 22 feet with a 5% grade. Okay, next to that main ramp, so there's the main ramp going up to the platform at the top. Next to the main ramp, you see this blue. This is a nice color-coded diagram. This blue, let me find my cursor. You have a lower ramp that goes up to a ledge, and you see that ledge encircles the platform on 3 sides. Okay, so a lower ramp with a ledge that goes on 3 sides. We'll come back to that in a little bit. And then in the front of the main platform, you have these 2 courtyards on either side of the ramp, and Shai talked about those last time. Okay, all I want you to see here, we'll talk about some of those features, but I just want you to see the difference in design between the 4-room house and the early Iron Age structure at Mount Ebal. Everybody see the difference? Show me your hands if you see the difference. Okay, all right. Okay, so let's go on. Kempinski also said that, well, maybe it started out as a house and it evolved into a tower. It was remodeled into a defensive tower in the Iron Age 1. Well, towers were not a part of the early Iron Age 1 Highland settlements. All right, when we look across all the known sites from the early Iron Age settlement in the Highlands, we don't have fortifications. The earliest known Iron Age fortifications are from Iron Age 2 sites, places like Tel Nazbe, Tel Beit Mersim, Beit Shemesh, and so on and so forth. And until recently, we didn't even have any examples of freestanding towers in the tribal territories of either Manasseh or Ephraim. A few have been discovered by the Manasseh Hills Country Survey, all right, initiated by Zertal. A few have been discovered in the Jordan Valley, but they date to the Iron Age 2 and they're round. Okay, so they don't comport either in date or style with the Ebal structure. I'll give you some examples. These are some towers, Iron Age 2 towers found in the Jordan Valley. This one is at a place called Kirbet Eshak. So you can see the rounded tower there, right? Defensive tower. Here's another one, Kirbet El Makruk. Here's another one, Rum Abu Mukhair. Okay. So this is a network of 3 towers that Zertal didn't find them all, but he surveyed them in the Manasseh Hill Country Survey and published them in the survey reports. What's significant about them is that you see from the map here, they're down in the desert, close to the Jordan River, right? See the Jordan River there? So they're just in the desert, close to the Jordan River. And the earliest pottery they have dates to the 10th century. Kirbet Eshak, 10th century. El Makruk has the latest down to the 9th century. They appear to have provided a defensive network to dominate the road and region there in the Jordan Valley. And they may date either to the reign of Solomon down through Jeroboam I, or maybe even the time of Ahab. So you see they're much, much later than the settlement period, okay? All right. Again, towers did not exist as components of fortifications in the Middle and Late Bronze Age. I'm sorry, they did exist as components of fortifications in the Middle and Late Bronze Age, but not as freestanding units. And we don't have any examples of fortifications or temples from the Iron Age 1. So what I'm telling you here is that this type of tower that Kempinski suggests that Ebal structure may have been, these weren't built in Israel during this period, all right? The Israelites settled in the highlands as a semi-nomadic people. They were sedentarizing after many years as semi-nomads. They weren't building fortified sites, okay? Okay, so what about the idea that this may have been an altar? Let's talk about that. We only have 2 types of altars for which we have instructions given in the Torah. And the instructions we have are given in the book of Exodus. First, we have instructions for an earthen altar, okay? We'll come back, we'll talk about each one of these. And then we have the instructions for the tabernacle altar. Okay, so 2 types of altars. All right, let's talk about each one of them. All right, first of all, earthen altars. You read these instructions here for the earthen altars. We actually have 2 types of earthen altars that are for which we're given instructions in Exodus chapter 20. The first type is where you just heap up some soil in an open field. Okay, you're in an open field and you want to make an offering, you can just shovel some soil into a pile and make an earthen altar. That's one type of earthen altar. Exodus 20, verse 24. The second type of earthen altar is where you just pull together some unworked stones into a pile. Okay, so these are again very basic types of altars referred to as earthen altars. So very little information about these. The instructions are very simple. They don't give any specifications about what the dimensions of these earthen altars should be. There's no specifications about the length, the width, the height, the shape, whether they're supposed to be round, square, or oblong, okay? There's nothing about whether they're to be symmetrical, that is, whether the top and the bottom were to be the same, width and so on, or was it built in tiers, nothing like that. The instructions don't mention whether they were to have horns or not. The instructions don't say whether the altar was to be oriented in a specific direction. Okay, again, just very basic instructions. Just shovel together a little heap of soil, there's your altar. Shovel together some stones into a pile, there's your altar of unworked stones. Okay, the only they do have one specification. I'll come to that in just a second. But in Nahum Sarna's wonderful commentary on the book of Exodus, he talked about these earthen altars. And he suggested that the laws given in Exodus 20 about these were addressed to individual Israelites, and that they reflect and regulate the altars and the worship that characterized the popular lay religion before the implementation of Deuteronomic law, which concentrated all sacrificial worship exclusively in one official national religious center. Okay. Before that time, the altars for which instructions were given in Exodus 20, they belonged to the category of impromptu altars that were built by people like Noah, the patriarchs, Gideon, Manoah, and others, and so on. Okay. Again, very simple, very rustic, no specifications. The only stipulation about these earthen altars was that they not use steps. Okay, they weren't to have steps, and this appears to have been a measure to ensure that that personal discretion would be exercised in the use of the altar. But the fact that steps were prohibited means there had to have been some other way of getting up the altar, and that suggests that maybe a ramp might be used, although the instructions don't specify that. Okay, that's the earthen altar. I'm going to try to keep moving and go quickly. I don't want to run out of time. Okay, so two types of altars. First one is the earthen altar. We get the altar of soil and the altar of unworked stones. Let's go to the second main type of altar in the book of Exodus. It's the tabernacle altar. And we have more detailed instructions about the tabernacle altar. Those instructions are given in Exodus 27, verses 1 through 8. And the details for this altar are complicated and they're not precisely understood. So as we go through this, you'll see what I mean. It's not totally clear, but I think it's clear enough. The dimensions are clear. This altar was to be about 7.5 feet by 7.5 feet by 4.5 feet. Okay, so the measurements are clear. It was supposed to have horns on each of its four corners. All right. Okay. So kind of a squarish structure, almost 5 feet high, all right, with horns on the four corners. Okay. Now, the instructions include a device called the mikbar, and that's generally been understood as some kind of a grate or a strainer. Okay, that appears in Exodus 27, verse 4. The position of the mikbar, the grate or the strainer, the position and location of it are not totally clear. It's also called a ma'asher reshet nechoshet, okay, which has been translated a network of bronze. All right, so this appears to have been some kind of a system of gratings. All right, and I think these gratings were probably located inside the altar. All right, halfway up from the ground level. And on the grating, the wood for the fire would be positioned, okay? And then maybe another grating would have been situated farther up on which the meat would have been barbecued, okay? And the upper grating would allow for oxygen to go down and oxygenate the fire below. And that upper grating would also allow for fat and ashes to drip down. Okay, does that make sense? So what are the implications of that description. Okay, you've got this 7.5 by 7.5 foot structure, about 5 feet tall. Theoretically, a system of 2 gratings inside, wood for the sacrifice on the bottom grating, the meat on the top, and oxygenation that's allowed to go in through the top grating and oxygenate the fire below. What are the implications of this description? Okay, since you're all muted and I can't hear your answers, I'll just say it. The implications of that description from Exodus are that the structure was hollow, okay? The implications are that the altar, the tabernacle altar, was hollow, okay? That's very significant. It's significant because if you look at the structure at Ebal, so this is the plan of the Iron Age structure at Ebal. There's that front ramp to get you oriented, right? There's that front ramp. This is a courtyard to its left, the other courtyard to the right. Here is that lower ramp and the ledge that goes around 3 sides, okay? When they excavated the structure, there was a layer of stones on top, but when they took that off, they discovered that the interior of the structure was hollow, okay? Right there, see, you see the hollow interior, and you see there the hollow interior. That whole area inside, trying to find my cursor, there it is. Yeah, you see that whole area inside was hollow. And then you have these support walls, partial support walls inside, wall 16 and wall 13 there. All right. Now, what was inside that hollow area? Well, it was full of 4 layers of ash. And I think that Shai discussed this some last time. So those are photographs taken from inside the hollow area. Okay. So I climbed down inside. And where's yeah, so I'm standing inside somewhere over here, and this is the interior. All right, you see how deep it is down here? There's just another angle. Okay, so filling up that entire hollow area was 4 layers of ash, and these layers included burned bone remains and so on. All right, now some critics, there's one critic particularly, his name is, well, Anson Rainey, I'm sorry. Yeah, Anson Rainey, just a wonderful scholar. And in some, I would have considered him a colleague and a friend. He died a few years ago. But anyway, in 1986, he wrote just a vociferous criticism of the idea that this structure was an altar. And he said altars did not have rooms. He said these hollow areas shouldn't be there. If this was an altar, it shouldn't have had what he called rooms. There shouldn't have been this hollow area. And so he argued this was a house or something like this, and these cavities were rooms. Okay, look, though, I want you to see, this is a drawing from a copy of the Mishnah. One of the books in the Mishnah is called Mishnah Midot. All right. So Mishnah Midot has illustration. Most editions will have illustrations in it. And this is a drawing of the 1st century BCE altar from the Jerusalem temple as it was reconstructed by the authors of Tractate Midot. Okay. Now look carefully at the structure. You see it has a ramp going up to a platform, okay? You see it has a secondary ramp going up to a ledge that goes around the side, okay? All right, do you see some similarities? Okay, again, I can't hear your answers, but what about the idea that ashes would accumulate in the interior of the structure, all right? In this picture, it looks like you have a flat surface up here. Again, the instructions are kind of complicated in the Hebrew of the book of Exodus, so it's hard to know exactly what it looked like. but the instructions seem to suggest there was at least a portion of the interior that was hollow. And when you read Mishnah Midot, it's clear that somehow ash would accumulate from the inside of the altar and it would pile up. Okay. It piled up so much that what they would do, this ledge here that goes around the three sides of the altar in the Mishnah, it's called the Sovev, okay, in Mishnah chapter 3. And what they would do with this Sovev is the priest would go up the Sovev and he could walk around three sides of the altar, and he could take a long tool like a rake, and he would push the ashes toward the center of the structure, and he would push them so that they would accumulate in the center. And in the Mishnah, this ash would be allowed to pile up in the center, and it was considered an adornment of the altar. Okay, the more ash that would be allowed to accumulate and pile up in the center, the more it demonstrated that the Lord was doing his atoning work on behalf of his people. Does that make sense? The more it would show that sacrifices were being performed. And so they just keep shoveling those ashes to the center, and they would allow them to pile up. And in the Mishnah, the pile would be rounded, and they actually called it the tapuach, okay, which literally means apple. So it was considered a beautification of the altar. Think of it as the apple of God's eye, as that tapuach would grow in the center of the altar, it was considered an adornment. It demonstrated that the altar was being used to make sacrifices to God, and that God was doing his work on behalf of the people. Does that make sense? Okay, so again, that's very, very significant. So the idea of a hollow interior for the structure as an altar comports very well, from my understanding, with the instructions in Exodus for the tabernacle altar, and it comports well with what we know about the nature and function of the altar in the first century from Mishnah Midot. Okay, again, I already mentioned it, but you have the secondary ramp that goes up the side, and in the Mishnah that's called the Sovev. And part of the way it functioned here, the surface of the altar was considered holy, so priests couldn't go up there and just trample all over it, right? So they would walk up the secondary ramp, and they'd walk around the Sovev, and they'd use this long, like a rake, to manipulate the offerings on the flat surface of the altar. Okay, does that make sense? Now, when Zertal excavated it, the top of this was sealed. It was a flat stone surface that they had to uncover, but the interior was hollow. Okay. In the end, they buried the entire structure to prevent the structure being used after it had gone out of commission. So they desacralized it, if that makes sense. Okay. And it may be that they sealed the top prior to covering the entire structure as part of the desacralization process. Okay. Okay. So we have those hollow interiors. And then also Shai told you about the installations, right? You see those in this drawing. In the site plan that Shai showed us, I don't think I didn't include a picture of those, but there are over 50 of these installations in the courtyard and scattered around the sides of the main structure. So in the hollow interior and in these installations, you have all the remnants of the ash. And I want to just mention briefly, what time do I finish, Aaron? 3 or 2:50? Some.
We're flexible, right, guys?
Okay. Okay. Well, I'm getting close. I just don't want to go too far over.
Okay.
Okay, so in those installations, you had pots where people would fill those pots with remains of offerings. So they would put bone and ash remains in the pots. There's one of the pots found in an installation. And then they would put those pots in the installations. They would dig this little hole and encircle it with stones. And there they deposited these pots. And then inside the structure itself, you have the layers of ash. What all was there? Well, donkeys, horses, pigs, carnivores, and gazelles were all absent from the Ebal site. And that's not an accident, because gazelle and pig were present in the immediate vicinity. Okay, across those mountains, there were gazelle and pig, but they're not in any of these remains at the Ebal site. What is in here are the remains of animals, and primarily what's there are the remains of foreparts. That's very interesting. The foreparts of animals, the percentage of foreparts is higher than at any other Iron Age 1 site. Why does that matter? Who cares? Well, if you go back to the Torah, you'll learn that the Israelites were instructed to sacrifice the right foreleg. So here's a diagram from the Mishnah giving instructions about this and describing the different parts of the animal. They were instructed to sacrifice the right foreleg to the Lord and give the right hind leg to the priest. Okay, now certain types of offerings, this differs from one offering to the other. This is in the case of the type of offering known as the shlemim. The shlemim, it comes from the Hebrew word shalom. It's often translated as the peace offering, sometimes as the fellowship offering. What would happen in the shlemim is that the Israelites would sacrifice the right foreleg, they'd give the hind leg to the priest, so that would be the priest's allowance, so he and his family could eat. And what would happen is the Israelite family who had come to make the offering, they would eat the rest of the animal. So the shlemim was kind of like this outdoor barbecue that took place at the altar. They would gather around the altar. They'd give the right foreleg to the priest to make the offering. Then they'd give him the hind leg where he could save that out for his family. And then the families would sit at picnic tables around the altar, and they'd have this huge outdoor barbecue, okay, eating the rest of the animal. So the shlemim was a very festive sacrifice that included like an outdoor barbecue, a picnic, okay? You remember at the beginning of this lecture, I mentioned Bill Deaver's joking comment from 1992 where he said, this was just, here he is. Oh, here he is saying it. That's Bill Deaver. He says the Ebal site was just an ancient barbecue site where families enjoyed picnics, right? I love that. There's Zertal sitting on a stool in the field smiling. He was such a joyful man. And he said, that though Deaver intended to curse, he blessed. Right? He meant this as a joking dismissal of the site. But what was the shlemim? It was an outdoor picnic, right? I love that because Zertal took Deaver's criticism and turned it into praise and adulation for the Ebal site. All right. Well, I'll wrap up here pretty quickly. I had the pleasure of, when I was working on my dissertation, I had the pleasure of going with Zertal on an expedition to the Ebal site. At that time, no one was going there. The site was completely closed. After they had finished the excavations, Zertal had tried to open it for tourism, but and they led some tours there. But in the year 2000, a tourist was shot by a sniper. And so the military closed the site, and for many years it was not open. I was trying to finish my PhD on the site in the early 2000s. And in 2002, we tried to make a plan to go to the site, and the Army canceled it. 2003, we tried to make a trip. The Army canceled it. 2004, we tried to make a trip. The Army canceled it. Every year they would cancel it. And finally, in 2007, a very religious colonel in the Israeli Defense Force, because Adam would make his request for us to go out there. A very religious colonel was like, "Why does this guy keep trying to get out to the site? What's going on?" And Adam said, "Well, he's trying to write his dissertation on the site. He wants the site to be more widely known." and so the colonel was like, "Praise God, let's make an expedition to the site." And so in 2007, the Army organized a trip to the site, and there we are up on top of Ebal. You can see the wall, the barricade. Here we are loading up. The Army base is just behind me there where I'm taking that photo. Here we are. We loaded up into armored cars. There's Adam, and tanks, big military procession heading out to the site. I was sitting in the back of this armored vehicle, and there's Adam turning back to make sure I was comfortable. But we went out to the site, and here we are approaching the site. The roads get pretty rough, or at least they did at that time, and you'd have to disembark and finish the trip on foot. So here we are approaching the site. You can see the wall encircling the site and the main structure there up in the distance. And as we approached the site, which you see there, it just took my breath away. If you are coming from a Christian perspective, you may recall the story of Zechariah when he believed that he saw the Messiah. He said, "I can now die in peace, for my eyes have seen the glory of the Lord." And that's how I felt when the Ebal structure came into view as we approached the site. We went up to the site, and at that time, Zertal had envisioned a great tourist thing. He thought people would make pilgrimage to the site, and they had set up an entrance area, and just in front of that was a booth where people would pay their entrance fee, and then they'd go through the gate to the site. When I went there in 2007, that was locked up and overgrown, and no one had been there in years. Aaron, thank the Lord, is changing that these days. But here we are up next to the site, and if you haven't been there, this gives you some site comparison, because here we are standing in front of the site. There's Adam, and you can see just how monumental of a structure this is. Here's just another angle. You can see the platform there at the top, and you can see the ramp at the 5% grade extending for 22 feet there. And again, there we are standing over to the side. We spent the day at the site taking photographs and measurements, and I was trying to check all the data about the site that I had read and studied, and take photographs of all the details and prepare for writing my dissertation. And at the end of the day, it was so interesting. The soldiers, we had a huge contingent of soldiers with us to escort us to the site and keep us safe. They wanted to know, what's going on? What is this site? And, what's this all about? And Adam took out a laminated site plan and called the soldiers to come in, and they all gathered around the site. And when Adam explained to them the significance of the site, you can see what happened. Here he is explaining the significance of the site. They immediately pulled out their kippot, and you can see they've put their kippots on their head, and they immediately whipped out Bibles and started reading Joshua 8:30-35. And it was a very sacred and holy moment to them. They understood immediately the significance of the Ebal site for who they were and what they were doing, who they were as Israelis, and what their setting their own feet on this land meant for them. And it was a holy moment for me too. If you've not been to the Ebal site, I hope that you'll take advantage of Aaron's dynamic new programs where he is taking visitors to the site today. It will change your life. And that's my own overview, specifically of the issues around interpreting the site and how I have sorted through the different hypotheses about understanding the site and how I understand it today. So thank you so much for your attention, and appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much, Ralph. I just wanted to add one thing that, when we talk about the hollow altar and we read about the instructions to Moses and the Israelites to build an altar for the tabernacle, what it says in Exodus 27, verse 8, make the altar hollow out of boards. It is to be made just as you were shown on the mountain. And so,
Right. Yes.
both you and Professor Zertal are talking about this change between the mobile altar of the tabernacle that was hollow, going into
Right.
the land of Israel, building a stone altar, and then ending up building a more a more designed altar at the temple. But you see can I use the word evolution? You see the evolution of the altar
Yeah.
from the desert time to the temple.
Right. And thank you for mentioning that, Aaron. I meant to say that in the end. I think essentially what we have at the Ebal structure is a stone version of the tabernacle altar. That's what we have here.
And while people are writing their questions in the program in the chat box at the bottom, I just also wanted to mention that today there are regular visits to Mount Ebal on a weekly basis. I'm actually going up to Mount Ebal next week with a tourist, the first tourist that we have since COVID broke. I'm going to go up with him to Mount Ebal to visit the altar with another group, where afterwards we're going to Sebastia, ancient Samaria. All these sites are open for tourism, and you can just hop on a bus or come with your rented car and visit them. And it's very safe and pleasant, and you're all invited to come and visit those sites. So, Ralph, would you like to answer the questions?
Sure. Let's see. So you want me to go through them, or are you going to read them?
You can go through them, the chat box.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah. So one questioner has asked, "What's my understanding about who buried the site and their agenda?" Yeah. So the site was eventually buried under a huge mound of stones, and we read in the book of Joshua that eventually the site of Israel's sanctuary shifted. So if you accept the description of the early Israelite entrance into the land of Canaan in the book of Joshua chapter 3, the Israelites crossed the Jordan River into the land of Canaan, and they began to migrate west across the Jordan Valley and eventually settle in the highlands. Well, over the course of that movement, they had several places where they stopped and camped. And of course, the first one is mentioned in Joshua chapter 3. They stopped at a place called Gilgal. And I didn't discuss these sites because of the time, but Zertal surmised, I think correctly, that the Gilgal was not a specific place, but a type of place. And he has found a number of sites that are in the shape of a sandal that he calls Gilgalim. So these are types of sites where they made altars and had either tribal or some kind of smaller group. Eventually, when they reached Ebal, they set up a centralized site. That explains the monumental nature of the structure as opposed to the smaller altars at the Gilgalim. But then eventually, by the time you get later in the book of Joshua, about Joshua 20, they moved the sanctuary to Shiloh. And then, of course, eventually it's moved to Jerusalem. So I don't think the covering of the Ebal site by stones was anything hostile or something done by outsiders or someone who was antagonistic to the site, but it was probably simply a process of decommissioning. Um, when the Israelites moved on and ceased using the Ebal site, or their focus moved to another centralized sacred site, they didn't want strangers going to the Ebal site and playing with it or tampering with it, so they buried it under a heap of stones. And we actually see this phenomena in other sites from the ancient Near East where cultic sites were buried. And most archaeologists think this was a way of desacralizing them or decommissioning them. So the pile of stones over the altar would prevent other people from, from going there and tampering with it and exercising deviant religious practices or something there, and therefore desecrating the name of the Hebrew God. So that's probably what it was. Yeah, let's see.
Ralph, if you can scroll all the way up, there are several questions. I think that if you can start from the beginning.
Okay, let me try to go back down here. Does Gilo, an ancient, okay, Boyd Sievers, mouse here so I can work more quickly. Boyd Sievers is asking whether Gilo, an Iron Age 1 site near Jerusalem excavated by Amihai Mazar, not have a tower. I believe it was squarish, but it may have dated later. Yes, that's a great question, Boyd. And Zertal discussed the Gilo site already in sorting out, in evaluating interpretations and exploring parallels and things. The Gilo site, does it not have a tower? I believe it was squarish, but it may have dated later. I'm a little rusty and I'd need to go back and check. I believe that the square tower is iron 2. It is there, but it's iron 2. So yeah, but I'm trying to remember where Zertal discussed this offhand. It's in one of his pieces. I wrote the article on Gilo in the New Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible, and I discussed the data comparing the Gilo structure with the Ebal structure. And I cite Zertal's original references just offhand. I can't bring that data to mind, so I'm going to go ahead and skip it. But a great question. Zertal did address it, and I believe because the Gilo site or the square structure at the Gilo site dates a little bit later, he argued it wasn't a parallel. Joel Garbone asks, what about any writings on one of the stones which could refer to a copy of the Torah as mentioned in Joshua? I had to slip out at the end of Shai's lecture last week, so I didn't catch the Q&A. I know in his lecture he did mention the clay that had been found at the Ebal site. And I had some pictures of the clay collection, but I didn't, or the plaster collection, I mean, that had been recovered, but I didn't include it in this lecture because I was just trying to focus on the architecture and the interpretation. But yeah, there was plaster recovered. So far, they have not discovered any writing on that plaster. Shai did mention in his lecture that they've held on to it in the hopes that innovative technologies may allow for even a closer examination of the plaster remains, with the idea that the re-examination may yet yield, some writing, but as of yet, no. He did talk about the rarity of plastering a site, though. That is something Zertal also discussed in a number of his publications. Plastering a site was something very rare, and it was often associated with cultic sites. And so, the fact that plaster remains were recovered from the Ebal site could be yet one more piece of indicative data that reinforces a cultic, conception of the site, but no written text yet. Thank you, Daniel. Let's see. Okay, I answered that one about the burial. Let's see. Shmuel Wolkenfeld says if Mount Gerizim is not in the line of sight to Har Eval, how can the dramatic reading of blessings and curses take place? That's a great question, and I think Shai, he at least touched on it last time, but I don't know if he talked about it. Might have mentioned it more in depth during the Q&A. Zertal wrote quite a bit of this. He wrote a paperback book called Am Noled, which means Birth of a Nation. And Aaron had that little book translated into English and published it just a few years ago. I don't remember the publication date on that, but you can read Adam's discussion there, and I'm sure you can order the book through Aaron, or he can tell you how to get it. But just to put it in a nutshell, Zertal had postulated there's some discrepancy in the ancient textual witnesses about between the Masoretic text and the Samaritan Pentateuch about the location of Mount Gerizim. Eusebius, who wrote a kind of a geographical guide to the area several centuries later, he argued that the traditional location of Gerizim was wrong, and so there was some tradition in antiquity that the identification of Gerizim had moved, and of course this goes back to the kind of a conflict between the ancient Israelites and the Samaritans. Shai touched on that a little bit. It's a little bit of a political hot potato, but Zertal had speculated that the correct location of Gerizim in antiquity was Mount Kabir, and that it lies across the valley to the north of Ebal. So that would indeed put the Ebal site directly opposite Mount Kabir. And then then obviously that would solve the issue. Okay, but yeah, in the book, Amnolad as the writing, Birth of a Nation is that. Archbishop Dominique, I can't see the full name, says Yofi. Thank you so much, Your Grace. Thank you, Aaron and Ralph. Karen asks, thank you. I've had the great pleasure of going to see Joshua's altar. As we're leaving the site that day, a group of Israeli students were singing Am Yisrael Chai as they came up. Wow, what a sight. They turned to me and asked me to say it too, and I had great joy as I said Am Yisrael Chai with them. That's a great story. I hope you got some of that on video. Zach says, did you say that the altar's top was open while it was in use? Yes, presumably. It's very clear when you read the excavation report that the ash accumulation inside the hollow interior of the structure, I kind of rushed through that very quickly. It's interesting because there were 4 layers, and the layers were they weren't intermingled. They were like flat layers, and each on top of the other with a slight slope at the side. So it was as if somebody had poured in one layer, where it sloped from the site where they poured, and then somebody had come in and poured a second layer, third layer, fourth layer. So they were all laid down, at some point And that maybe that was part of the decommissioning process at the end or something. It was filled with these remains and then sealed. But yes, presumably it would have been opened during its usage. If so, upon what service do you think the offerings would have been burned? That's part of the kind of puzzle when you read the instructions for the tabernacle altar. Again, it's not completely clear. I mean, I've given you a reconstruction of the system of gratings that I think makes some sense. And in the Exodus passage, based on that reconstruction, you'd have the offering sitting on the top grating. I don't know if there was some, at the Ebal structure, if that was indeed how the design worked. Maybe there was some kind of a system of gratings in place, there. Maybe those interior walls 13 and 16, somehow played a part in supporting some kind of an upper structure. I can't really answer that in any more comprehensive way. Jerry says pottery sherds at the site on the surface would be from what period? Yeah, I didn't put the photo in because, again, I was trying to keep from going too long, but all around the site, Adam said that pottery that was distinctive of the LB Iron One transition period. So the latter part of the late Bronze Age. The late Bronze Age, again, goes from 1550 to 1200. And then the early Iron Age 1 goes from 1200 to 1000. Adam, there's this, I don't want to get too technical, but Adam, that there is a chronology that actually argues for extending the Iron Age 1 to 1250 BC, so 1250 to 1000. And Adam typically followed that chronology. That was a chronology that Amichai Mazar lays out in one of his pieces. So the Ebal site was founded in about 1220, 1230 BC, and then it went out of commission in the 12th century. So the ceramics at the Ebal site date to that transitional period, like 1250 to the early part of the 12th century BC. And Zertal, when you go past the Ebal site, it starts to slope down toward the valley. And then behind it, it slopes down into a sort of recession, and then it starts to ascend towards the summit of Mount Ebal. And it forms a huge area, kind of like what's at those Gilgalim sites, kind of a natural amphitheater around the Ebal site where hundreds and thousands of people could have gathered. And Zertal said that during the survey, the pottery from that transitional period just crunched under their feet, all in that entire area. So yeah, pottery from roughly 1200, the years leading down to 1200 and just past. Okay. You stop me, Aaron, when you want.
Let's do two more and finish.
This one kind of overlaps. Jenny Weemhoff asks, do you mean the altar was hollow during operation and only filled with ash when covering? I don't know. Again, Zertal surmised that at some point these ash layers were poured into the hollow interior to form these homogeneous layers that accumulated in the hollow interior. So if the interior was hollow, as again Aaron highlighted that a little while ago, if the interior was hollow as the tabernacle altar was presumably hollow, then that would allow for oxygenation. So one would presume that if the structure was indeed an altar, and if it was being used in that way with some kind of a similar design, then the interior would have to be hollow to allow for that oxygenation. So presumably at some point late in the structure's history, it's possible the site may have gone out of usage at some point, once the central cult site shifted to Shiloh, or, people may have continued to visit it just as a memorial. Maybe they went there to pray, so it might have been filled in and then the top sealed, but people continued to visit it for decades before it was finally buried. I mean, we don't know for sure. And maybe as final data is being gathered and studied for the production of the final report, maybe some of that can be clarified. So I don't know if that helps, Jenny, but maybe that's a little helpful. And then Jerry Feldman asked, will I be in San Antonio? Yes. Anybody would like to get together for coffee, I'll be there. Would love to get together. And then finally, Shmuel says, Todah Rabbah. So thank you so much. Can I stop? Should I stop there, Aaron?
Yes. Otherwise, people will start snoring. So
I don't want that. Yeah. Thank you so much. Such an honor.
Thank you so much, Ralph, for a very fascinating lecture. Again, I would like to recommend everyone purchase Ralph's books that I'm holding. We're actually going to send a list of books, bibliography, for people if you want to purchase these books. Also, people asked about the survey volumes of the Manasseh Hill Country Survey. So we'll also send links to order these. Next week, we're going to have Dr. Scott Stripling speak about our special secret operation on Mount Ebal from a few years back. And we're also going to discuss a very exciting finding that was found during the wet sifting on that site. And another surprise that I have for all of you, many people saw Adam Zertal's picture on the list of lecturers. And so people asked me, Adam, passed away, he's not going to speak. So the surprise we have is that we obtained a video of no other than Adam Zertal guiding in English on Mount Ebal. So we're going to share that video on the next newsletter, as well as the recording of this lecture by Dr. Ralph. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Ralph, for lecturing. And this was another amazing lecture. And we're looking forward to seeing you next week. Shalom from Israel.
Shalom. Thank you.